The diner smelled of burnt coffee and cheap industrial bleach. It was the kind of place where bad decisions were made at 3 a.m. over cold hash browns. Sadie just wanted to finish her shift and pay her rent. She didn't care about the men in the $2,000 suits taking up booth 4. But when a careless glance at the contract on their table triggered her dormant law degree, an impulsive warning slipped past her lips. And just like that, everything changed. The neon sign above the window buzzed with a dying, erratic hum. The E in Starlight Diner had burnt out 3 years ago. Now it was just the Starlight Diner, a grease-stained purgatory on the wrong side of the city limits. Sadie pressed a damp rag into the cracked red vinyl of booth 2, scrubbing at a ketchup stain that had likely set into the material sometime during the Bush administration. She was 26, running on 4 hours of sleep and severely underpaid. Her feet ached. A dull throb pulsed behind her left eye. She wiped her forehead with the back of her wrist, leaving a faint smudge of grease near her hairline. The diner was empty, save for the old man asleep over his crossword in the corner, and Jim, the line cook, scraping the grill with a dull spatula. Then the bells above the glass door chimed. The chime was meant to be cheerful. At 2 a.m, it sounded like a warning. Sadie threw the rag over her shoulder and turned. 3 men walked in. The air in the room immediately shifted, growing heavier, as if the atmospheric pressure had suddenly dropped. They didn't belong here. That much was obvious. You didn't wear tailored charcoal grey wool suits to a place that served $2 filter coffee. The man in the center was tall, broad-shouldered, with sharp, angular features and dark hair swept neatly back. He wore a faint, easy smile. It wasn't a friendly smile. It was the smile of a man who owned the pavement he walked on, Roman Moretti. Sadie didn't know his name, but she recognized the type. She had spent 3 years at a top-tier law school before her mother's medical bills tore her life apart. She knew power when she saw it. She had watched trust fund kids and corporate sharks strut through university halls with that same untouchable arrogance. But the man standing by the door had something else, a quiet, lethal stillness. He slid into booth 4, the one furthest from the windows. His 2 companions, human walls built of muscle and cheap cologne, took up positions nearby. One sat across from him. The other stood near the jukebox, eyes scanning the street outside. "Coffee," Roman said. His voice was a low, smooth baritone that barely carried over the hum of the refrigerators. He didn't look at Sadie. He was looking at his gold wristwatch. "Black, bring a pot." Sadie didn't blink. She walked behind the counter, grabbed a fresh pot from the bun brewer, and gathered 3 thick ceramic mugs. She didn't like dealing with mobsters or gangsters or whatever these men were, but a paying customer was a paying customer, and she was 3 days late on her electricity bill. As she approached the table, another set of headlights swept across the diner's front windows. A black luxury sedan idled at the curb. 2 more men entered. The leader was older, thick around the middle, wearing a camel hair coat that hung loosely over a wrinkled suit. His face was flushed, slick with a thin sheen of sweat. He looked nervous. He looked like a man trying very hard to hide the fact that he was nervous. He slid into the booth opposite Roman. The human wall who had been sitting there vacated the seat instantly, moving to stand by his partner. "Arthur," Roman said. The easy smile remained. "You're late." "Traffic," Arthur muttered, waving a dismissive hand. He carried a sleek leather briefcase. He dropped it onto the sticky laminate table with a heavy thud. "Let's just get this over with. I have a flight at 6. Sadie poured the coffee. Thick, dark liquid filled the mugs. Steam spiraled into the cool diner air. She kept her eyes down, rendering herself invisible. It was a survival tactic she had perfected over the last 2 years. Be the furniture, be the wallpaper. Always in a rush, Roman mused, taking a slow sip of the scalding coffee. He didn't flinch. "You brought the paperwork." Arthur unlatched the briefcase. The sharp clicks echoed in the quiet diner. He pulled out a thick stack of stapled documents and slid them across the table. "Everything we discussed, the transfer of the warehouse district properties, the dissolution of our mutual liabilities, standard boilerplate. My lawyers looked it over twice." Roman set his mug down. He picked up the contract. Sadie moved away, retreating behind the counter. She pulled out a fresh rag and began wiping the stainless steel prep area, but her eyes kept drifting back to booth 4. Arthur was tapping his fingers against his coffee mug. Rapid, erratic taps. He was sweating more now. Roman, on the other hand, was entirely relaxed. He flipped through the pages slowly, his dark eyes scanning the text with casual indifference. He wasn't really reading it. Sadie could tell. He was skimming. He was looking at the bold headings, checking the dates. He trusted the deal. Or, more accurately, he trusted that Arthur was too terrified to cross him. "Sign on the last page," Arthur said, his voice tight. He pulled a silver fountain pen from his breast pocket and held it out. "We both walk away clean, just like we agreed." Roman reached for the pen. His thumb brushed the silver casing. He flipped to the final page of the document, the signature line glaring up at the dim fluorescent lights. Sadie picked up the coffee pot. The mugs at booth 4 were half empty. It was time for a refill. She didn't want to go back over there, but her manager's voice echoed in her head. "Keep the cups full, Sadie, or you're fired." She walked across the cracked linoleum floor, her rubber-soled shoes squeaking faintly. She reached the table just as Roman uncapped the pen. Sadie leaned in to pour the coffee. She aimed the spout at Roman's mug. Her eyes, purely out of habit, dropped to the papers spread across the table. She couldn't help it. 3 years of grueling legal training, of dissecting contracts until her eyes bled, of hunting for loopholes in massive corporate texts, had wired her brain a certain way. She saw the block of text just above the signature line. Section 14, subsection B. The legalese jumped out at her. The font was small. The phrasing was deliberately convoluted, a dense thicket of dependent clauses and cross-references meant to exhaust the reader. But Sadie was fluent in exhaustion. In the event of dissolution, the party of the first part agrees to waive all claims to indemnity regarding prior occupational hazards, transferring full liability of pending federal inquiries to the signatory. Her hand froze. The coffee stopped pouring. It was a liability sponge. Arthur wasn't just signing over the properties. He was offloading a massive, undocumented legal nightmare directly onto Roman. If Roman signed that paper, whatever federal heat Arthur was dodging would instantly become Roman's legal responsibility. It was a death warrant wrapped in a property deed. She looked at Arthur. He was holding his breath, staring at the tip of Roman's pen. The sweat on his forehead was gleaming. Roman brought the pen down to the paper. Sadie didn't think. The instinct was raw and deeply ingrained. She hated bullies. She hated people who used language to trap others. It was the same reason the hospital had nearly bankrupted her mother with hidden fees. "Excuse me, sir, but this clause is a trap," Sadie said. The words hung in the air, sharp and distinct against the hum of the refrigerator. Roman's hand stopped. The silver nib of the pen hovered a millimeter above the paper. Arthur's head snapped up. His eyes widened, his face draining of color. "What did you just say?" he barked, his voice cracking. "Get away from here, you stupid girl." Sadie realized what she had done. Her chest tightened. A cold dread washed over her, freezing the blood in her veins. She gripped the handle of the coffee pot so hard her knuckles turned white. She should apologize. She should step back, claim she was joking, and run into the kitchen. But Roman didn't look angry. He looked up at her, slowly. The easy, confident smile that had been plastered on his face since he walked through the doors was completely gone. His expression was a blank wall of stone, his dark eyes locked onto hers, piercing and unreadable. "What did you say?" Roman asked. His voice was quieter than before. It wasn't a threat. It was a demand for clarity. Arthur scrambled out of the booth. "Roman, don't listen to this idiot. She's a waitress. She doesn't know what she's talking about. Sign the paper." Roman didn't look at Arthur. He raised one hand, a subtle, dismissive gesture. Immediately, the two human walls stepped forward. One clamped a massive hand onto Arthur's shoulder, forcing him back down into the booth. Arthur swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing frantically. Roman turned his attention back to Sadie. "Show me." Sadie's hands were shaking. She carefully placed the coffee pot on the table to keep from dropping it. She pointed a trembling finger at the bottom paragraph of page 42. "Right there," she said, her voice barely a whisper. She cleared her throat, forcing herself to sound professional. Section 14, subsection B. It references an addendum that isn't attached, but the phrasing, transferring full liability of pending federal inquiries to the signatory. He's not just giving you the properties, he's making you the primary liable party for a federal investigation. If you sign this, you're admitting ownership of whatever illegal activity the feds are currently looking into on those properties. Silence descended on the diner. It was absolute and suffocating. The old man in the corner snored softly, entirely oblivious to the fact that the atmosphere in the room had just turned deadly. Roman stared at the text. He read it once. He read it again. He was not a lawyer, but he wasn't a fool either. Now that she had pointed it out, the malicious intent behind the convoluted words was glaringly obvious. He slowly screwed the cap back onto his silver pen. The metal scraped together with a quiet, final shink. He looked at Arthur. Arthur was trembling now. The flush had entirely left his face, leaving him looking sickly and grey. "Roman, wait, it's a mistake. My lawyers, they must have drafted it wrong. I didn't know." "You didn't know," Roman repeated. The words were flat, devoid of emotion. He leaned back in his seat, folding his hands over his stomach. "You brought me a 40-page contract at 2 a.m, told me it was standard boilerplate, and you didn't know it transferred a federal indictment onto my shoulders." "I swear it," Arthur pleaded, his voice rising in panic. Roman turned his gaze back to Sadie. The coldness in his eyes softened just a fraction. It was an incredibly unsettling shift. He looked at her not as a piece of background furniture, but as a person, as an anomaly. "What's your name?" he asked. "Sadie," she managed to say. Her throat was bone dry. "Sadie," Roman said, testing the name. He reached out and tapped the paper. "Where did a waitress learn to read a hidden indemnity clause?" "I went to law school," she stammered. "For 3 years. I had to drop out." Roman studied her face. He took in her exhausted eyes, the cheap uniform, the grease smudge on her forehead. He nodded slowly, as if a puzzle piece had just snapped into place. "Arthur," Roman said softly, not breaking eye contact with Sadie. "Get out." "Roman, please." "Get out before I have my men take you out to the alley and break both of your hands so you can never sign a contract again," Roman said. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. The promise of violence was absolute. Arthur grabbed his briefcase, nearly tripping over his own feet as he scrambled out of the booth. He practically sprinted for the door, the bell chiming wildly as he burst out into the night. His sedan peeled away from the curb seconds later. Roman finally looked away from Sadie. He picked up the 42-page contract, tore it methodically down the middle, and dropped the pieces into his half-empty coffee mug. The thick paper soaked up the dark liquid, turning into a soggy, ruined mess. "Sit down, Sadie," Roman said. Sadie didn't move. Her fingers remained locked around the handle of the glass coffee pot, her knuckles a stark white. She looked down at the ruined contract soaking in the mug, then back up at the man who had just dismantled a federal trap without raising his voice. "I can't sit," Sadie said. Her voice felt thin, raspy. "I'm on the clock." Roman tilted his head. He gestured to the sprawling, empty diner. "Your section doesn't look terribly demanding at the moment. My manager watches the cameras. If I sit in a booth with a customer, I lose my job." Roman glanced up. He located the cheap, dome-shaped security camera mounted above the cash register. Its little red light blinked rhythmically. He looked at the bodyguard standing by the jukebox. The man didn't need a verbal command. He simply walked over, reached up, and yanked the wire from the back of the camera. The red light died. "You're off the clock," Roman said. "Sit." It wasn't a request. Sadie placed the coffee pot on the adjacent table and slid into the booth where Arthur had been sweating moments before. The vinyl crunched under her weight. She kept her hands folded in her lap, out of sight, because they wouldn't stop trembling. Up close, Roman Moretti was even more intimidating. He didn't smell like cheap diner coffee or stale grease. He smelled like expensive sandalwood and cold air. 3 years of law school," Roman began, his tone conversational. He picked up a paper napkin and carefully wiped a drop of spilled coffee from the laminate table. "Where?" "Columbia," she said. His eyebrows rose a fraction of an inch. "Columbia, that's a hard door to open, and an expensive one." "I had scholarships, academic mostly." "But you dropped out. My mother got sick, pancreatic." The words tasted like ash. She hated talking about it. She hated the pity that usually followed. But Roman's face didn't soften with hollow sympathy. He merely absorbed the information. The insurance company found a loophole in her policy. They classified her treatment as experimental. The bills wiped out her savings in 2 months. Then they wiped out mine. I had to leave school to work. You trade a courtroom for a diner. Roman looked around the grimy establishment, disdain evident in the slight curl of his lip. A tragic waste of a sharp mind. "It pays the rent? Barely." "And Arthur's contract?" Roman asked, bringing the focus back to the soggy mess in the mug. "You read it upside down in the time it took to pour a cup of coffee. That's an impressive parlor trick." "It wasn't a trick," Sadie said. The law was the one thing she still felt fiercely protective of. Her posture straightened. It was sloppy. Whoever drafted that clause relied on boilerplate fatigue. They buried the indemnity transfer under 3 paragraphs of standard property boundaries, assuming your lawyers would skim it. The phrasing was a dead giveaway. You don't use occupational hazards as a bridge to federal inquiries unless you're trying to mask criminal liability. Roman watched her. The silence stretched. Outside, the rain finally began to fall, fat drops smacking against the large glass windows. "My lawyers missed it," Roman said quietly. Sadie swallowed hard. Or they didn't want to find it. The implication hung heavily between them. If Roman's legal team had cleared that contract, it meant they were either completely incompetent or they had been bought by Arthur. Given the sheer size of the operation Roman clearly ran, incompetence seemed unlikely. Roman leaned forward. The shift in his posture made Sadie press back against her seat. "You saved me a considerable amount of trouble tonight, Sadie," he said. His voice dropped, losing its casual cadence. It was all business now. Cold, calculated business. "I owe you. I do not like being in debt. You don't owe me anything. I hate bullies. The insurance company used contracts to kill my mother. I saw Arthur trying to do the same thing to you." She let out a dry, humorless laugh. "Not that you need my protection." "Everyone needs protection," Roman countered. He reached inside his tailored jacket and pulled out a sleek, black leather wallet. He extracted a matte black business card and set it gently on the table. No name, no company logo, just a 10-digit phone number embossed in silver. Then he reached into his pocket and pulled out a thick money clip. He peeled off 5 $100 bills. He slid them under the sugar dispenser. "For the coffee," Roman said. "I can't take that." "You can, and you will." He stood up, buttoning his suit jacket with fluid, practiced grace. The 2 bodyguards immediately stepped to attention. When you get tired of smelling like burnt grease and watching your life drain away for minimum wage, call that number. I need someone who reads the small print, someone who hasn't been bought. Sadie stared at the black card. "I'm not a criminal." Roman paused. He looked down at her, the ghost of that dangerous smile returning to the corners of his mouth. "Neither am I, Sadie. I'm a pragmatist, and right now my legal department has a vacancy." He didn't wait for a reply. He turned and walked out. The bells chimed. The glass door clicked shut. The black sedan pulled up to the curb, swallowed him and his men, and disappeared into the rainy night. Sadie sat alone in the booth for a long time, listening to the heavy silence of the diner, the $500 mocking her from beneath the sugar dispenser. The dawn was aggressively ugly. It broke over the city in a bruised wash of purple and grey, filtering weakly through the smog. Sadie stood on the crowded bus, gripping the metal overhead rail as the vehicle lurched over potholes. She smelled of stale onions and desperation. When she finally unlocked the door to her cramped studio apartment, the smell didn't improve. Mildew and old dust. She dropped her keys into the ceramic bowl by the door. They landed next to a stack of envelopes. Most were stamped with angry red letters, "Final notice, past due." She didn't look at them. She couldn't. Sadie walked into the tiny bathroom, peeled off her uniform, and stepped under the shower. The water was lukewarm, the pressure barely a trickle. She leaned her forehead against the cold tile, letting the water run over her shoulders. She was exhausted down to the marrow of her bones. She thought about her mother's empty hospital bed. She thought about the mountain of debt that was slowly burying her alive. Then she thought about the matte black business card sitting on her kitchen counter, right next to the $500 in crisp, clean bills. When you get tired of watching your life drain away, Roman Moretti was a dangerous man. A brutal man, likely. The world he inhabited was built on blood, intimidation, and shadow. She knew that. But as she stood in her freezing shower, looking at the mold creeping up the grout lines, she realized something darker. The legitimate world hadn't treated her much better. The legitimate world had drafted a 60-page insurance policy designed specifically to let her mother die to save a profit margin. The legitimate world charged her late fees on rent she couldn't pay because she was paying off medical debt. At least Roman Moretti had looked her in the eye when he put his money on the table. She stepped out of the shower, wrapped a towel around herself, and walked into the kitchen. She picked up her cheap, cracked smartphone. She punched in the 10-digit number from the card before she could talk herself out of it. It rang once. "Yes," a male voice answered. Not Roman, a gravelly, blunt voice. "This is Sadie," she said. Her voice shook, so she cleared her throat and tried again. I'm calling for Roman." "Address?" the voice demanded. She gave it. "Be outside in 20 minutes." The line went dead. She dressed quickly. Black slacks she used to wear to moot court, a simple white blouse, a grey blazer. It felt like putting on armour she hadn't worn in years. Exactly 20 minutes later, a heavy black SUV idled at the curb outside her dilapidated building. The rear door opened from the inside as she approached. She climbed in. The interior smelled of rich leather. A man with a broken nose and eyes like chipped flint sat in the passenger seat. He didn't say a word as the driver pulled away. They didn't go to a seedy warehouse or a dimly lit club. They drove straight into the heart of the financial district. The SUV pulled into the underground garage of a sleek, glass-panelled high-rise. Sadie was escorted into a private elevator that bypassed the lobby and shot silently up to the 42nd floor. The doors parted to reveal a sprawling, minimalist office. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a dizzying view of the city skyline. It was blindingly clean. Men and women in sharp suits walked briskly across the carpeted floors, holding tablets and files. It looked like a Fortune 500 hedge fund. A sleek assistant led Sadie down a long hallway to a massive oak door. She opened it and stepped aside. Roman was standing by the window, looking out over the city, a phone pressed to his ear. He wore a navy suit today, tailored to perfection. He held up a finger, signaling her to wait, and finished his call in rapid, fluent Italian. He hung up and turned around. "You called," Roman said. He didn't look surprised. "I called," Sadie confirmed, standing her ground near the door. "But we need ground rules. I'm not carrying a gun. I'm not covering up murders. I do paperwork." Roman chuckled. It was a low, genuine sound that briefly transformed his harsh features. "I have men who carry guns, Sadie. I have men who handle the messy realities of my business. I didn't bring you here for violence. I brought you here for your mind." He walked over to a massive mahogany desk and picked up a thick manila folder. He tossed it onto the glass coffee table in the center of the room. "Sit," he instructed, gesturing to a modern leather sofa. She sat. He sat opposite her. Yesterday morning, a rival syndicate operating out of the ports proposed a joint venture. Roman explained, his eyes locked on hers. "They want to lease a section of my shipping yards. They claim it's for importing European textiles. They sent over their drafted lease agreement." He nodded toward the folder. "My senior counsel reviewed it. He said it was clean, a highly profitable, standard commercial lease." Sadie looked at the folder. "But you don't believe him. After last night, I don't believe anyone whose paycheck I sign. They get comfortable, they get lazy, or they get greedy." Roman leaned back, resting his elbows on the armrests. "Read it. Find the lie." Sadie reached out and pulled the folder onto her lap. It was thick, at least 60 pages of dense commercial real estate law. The familiar weight of the paper felt grounding. She opened the cover. Her eyes flicked over the opening clauses, skipping the preamble, diving straight into the meat of the obligations. The fear that had gripped her all morning began to recede, replaced by a cold, clinical focus. She was no longer a terrified waitress. She was hunting. The silence in the office was absolute. Roman didn't interrupt. He simply watched her read. 30 minutes passed, then 40. Sadie flipped back to page 22. She cross-referenced it with page 54. She ran a finger down the column of text, her eyes narrowing. She closed the folder. Your lawyer is either an idiot or he's been bribed, Sadie said flatly. Explain. Page 22 outlines the cargo restrictions. It explicitly forbids the storage of hazardous materials, which is standard. But page 54 is a zoning addendum. It reclassifies the leased section of the yard under an agricultural industrial code. Roman frowned. Which means, Sadie said, tapping the folder. Agricultural industrial codes have a federal loophole for the storage of high-grade ammonium nitrate. Fertilizer. If they sign this lease, they aren't bringing in textiles. They're bringing in explosive precursors, and they're storing it on your property. When the ATF raids the yard, the textiles will be a front, and you'll be the landlord, legally liable for housing bomb-making materials. Roman stared at the folder. The silence returned, but this time it was heavy with a dark, impending violence. He slowly looked up at Sadie. The smile was back. It was terrifying. "You're hired," Roman said. Sadie's new office did not have a window that looked out over a dirty alleyway. It had a wall of reinforced glass overlooking the East River. She had a teakwood desk, a leather ergonomic chair, and an espresso machine that cost more than her mother's first car. Within 48 hours of her hiring, a courier had arrived at her studio apartment with a cashier's check. It was enough to clear her mother's outstanding medical debt, pay off her student loans, and break her lease. Roman hadn't framed it as a gift. He called it a retainer. "I need my people focused," his brief, handwritten note had read. "Distractions are expensive." Now, 2 weeks into the job, Sadie understood exactly what he meant. She was not a member of Roman's legal team. She was a ghost. She operated entirely outside the chain of command, reporting solely to the 42nd floor. Every contract, every lease agreement, every merger and acquisition that the senior counsel cleared was quietly routed to Sadie's desk before Roman signed it. She was the final filter, the safety net. It was exhausting work. The sheer volume of Roman's legitimate businesses, real estate, shipping, waste management, hospitality, was staggering. But it was the illegitimate undertones that required her relentless attention. She spent 12 hours a day hunting for hidden daggers buried in boilerplate text. She took a sip of the bitter espresso. It tasted like ash, but it kept her awake. The door to her office clicked open without a knock. Sadie looked up from her monitor. A man stood in the doorway. He was in his late 50s, wearing a bespoke pinstripe suit, his silver hair perfectly coiffed. Trent Mitchell, Roman's senior counsel, the man whose job Sadie was effectively auditing. Trent didn't step fully into the room. He leaned against the doorframe, a posture of forced casualness that didn't reach his cold, pale eyes. "You're the new variable," Trent said. His voice was smooth, cultured, and dripping with quiet contempt. "Roman's little pet project." Sadie didn't blink. She deliberately saved the document she was working on, closed the laptop lid, and folded her hands on the desk. "I'm a consultant, Mr. Mitchell. I review risk." "You're a waitress who read a few torts textbooks," Trent countered, his smile thin and devoid of warmth. "I've spent 30 years building the legal architecture that keeps this organization insulated. I know every judge, every prosecutor, and every zoning commissioner in this city. You don't know the first thing about how this ecosystem actually functions." "I know how to read a zoning addendum on a shipping yard lease," Sadie replied evenly, a muscle feathered in Trent's jaw. The mention of the port contract, the one he had approved, the one Sadie had dismantled on her first day, was a direct hit. "An oversight," Trent clipped. "My junior associates missed a cross-reference. A federal explosives charge is a rather large oversight," Sadie said. She held his gaze, refusing to be bullied. She had dealt with men like Trent in law school. arrogant, entitled, threatened by anyone who didn't belong to their club. But if you're confident in your team's work, you shouldn't have any issue with me double-checking it. Trent pushed off the doorframe. He took 2 steps into the office, planting his hands on the edge of her teakwood desk. He leaned in. He smelled of scotch and expensive mints. "Listen to me very carefully," Trent murmured. "Roman is amused by you right now. He likes a novelty. But this is a machine, Sadie. A very large, very dangerous machine. You stick your hands into gears you don't understand, you're going to lose fingers. Stay out of my way." He turned and walked out, leaving the door open behind him. Sadie exhaled a shaky breath. Her heart was thudding against her ribs. She waited until his footsteps faded down the carpeted hallway, then opened her laptop again. She pulled up the file she had been analyzing before Trent's interruption. It was an internal document, a routine audit of a waste management subsidiary operating out of the Bronx. Trent's office had signed off on it yesterday. She scrolled down to the third quarter financial disbursements. She wasn't an accountant, but forensic law required a basic understanding of how money moved. And the money in this subsidiary was moving erratically. There were recurring payments, always just under the $10,000 reporting threshold, paid to an independent fleet maintenance company. Sadie cross-referenced the maintenance company in the state registry. It was an LLC registered in Delaware. The registered agent was a shell corporation. It was a classic bleed. Someone was siphoning money out of Roman's legitimate businesses, filtering it through dummy corporations and pocketing the cash. It wasn't a large enough sum to trip the major accounting alarms, but over a year it amounted to nearly $1 million. More importantly, Trent Mitchell's digital signature was on the quarterly approval. Sadie stared at the screen. The air in the office suddenly felt very cold. Finding a trap set by a rival was one thing. Finding a thief operating inside Roman's inner circle was entirely different. This wasn't just a legal loophole. This was treason. She picked up her desk phone and dialed the extension for the 42nd floor. "Yes," the gruff voice of Roman's security chief answered. "It's Sadie," she said. Her voice was steady, even though her hands were cold. "I need to see him. Now." Roman's office was dim. The sun had set an hour ago, painting the city in strokes of harsh neon and deep shadow. He sat behind his desk, leaning back in his chair, listening to the heavy silence that had fallen over the room. Sadie stood by the glass coffee table. She had laid the printed spreadsheets out in a neat chronological grid. She had just spent 20 minutes explaining the routing numbers, the Delaware LLC, and the deliberate structuring of the disbursements to avoid federal banking flags. Roman hadn't interrupted her once. He just watched the papers, his face an unreadable mask of stone. "The fleet maintenance company doesn't exist," Sadie concluded, her voice quiet in the cavernous room. "I checked the physical address listed on the incorporation papers. It's a vacant lot in Newark. Trent has been approving these disbursements for 14 months. The money is gone." Roman slowly sat forward. He picked up the final sheet of paper. He stared at Trent Mitchell's signature at the bottom of the page. $1 million, Roman said. It wasn't a question. It was a statement of fact. He didn't sound angry. He sounded profoundly disappointed. "Give or take 50,000, Sadie confirmed. She wrapped her arms around herself, suddenly feeling entirely out of her depth. "Roman, this isn't a missed clause. This is deliberate embezzlement. If the IRS audits that subsidiary, the money trail links directly back to your primary holding company." Roman set the paper down. He reached beneath his desk and pressed a small silver button. Less than 10 seconds later, the heavy oak doors opened. The man with the broken nose, the one who had picked Sadie up in the SUV, stepped inside. Bring Trent up here, Roman said quietly. Don't let him make any phone calls. The man nodded once and vanished, pulling the doors shut. Sadie took a step back. I should go. Stay, Roman commanded. His eyes flicked up to hers, pinning her in place. You found the rot. You stay and watch how it gets cut out. I'm a lawyer, Roman, not a spectator to whatever you're about to do. You're the person who signed his warrant, Roman corrected softly. It wasn't cruel, it was a brutal, necessary truth. You can't point a loaded gun, pull the trigger, and then close your eyes before the bullet hits. You need to understand the weight of your work here, Sadie. In a courtroom, a man loses money. In this room, a man loses his life. Sadie's breath hitched. She wanted to run. She wanted to walk out the door, take the elevator down to the street, and disappear back into the anonymity of a diner. But her feet remained planted on the plush carpet. She had chosen to make the call. 5 minutes later, the doors opened again. Trent Mitchell was shoved into the room. His bespoke suit was rumpled. He stumbled, catching himself on the back of a leather chair. His face was stark white, slick with a sudden, terrified sweat. He looked at Roman, then his eyes darted to Sadie, lingering on the spreadsheets spread across the coffee table. The realization hit him like a physical blow. "Roman!" Trent gasped, his cultured voice cracking into a pathetic whine. "Roman, whatever she told you, it's a lie. She's trying to frame me." Roman didn't raise his voice. He didn't stand up. He simply slid the spreadsheet across the mahogany wood. 14 months, Trent, Roman said. The quietness of his voice was terrifying. It filled the room, sucking all the oxygen out of the air. 14 months you've been bleeding my subsidiary to pay for your gambling debts in Atlantic City. No, I swear to God. I don't care about the money, Roman interrupted, his tone chillingly flat. I care about the exposure. You created a financial anomaly in my books. You gave the federal government a thread they could pull. Trent's knees buckled. He sank to the floor, grasping at the edge of Roman's desk. Please, I can put it back. I can fix the books. Please, Roman, 30 years I've served this family. 30 years. Roman looked down at the weeping man. There was no pity in his eyes, only a cold, pragmatic calculus. Take him out, Roman said to the broken-nosed guard standing by the door. Make it clean. No mess for the police to find. The guard stepped forward, grabbed Trent by the collar of his expensive suit, and hauled him to his feet. Trent sobbed, a wretched, broken sound, as he was dragged out of the office. The heavy oak doors clicked shut, severing the noise completely. The silence that followed was deafening. Sadie stared at the closed doors. Her hands were shaking violently. The reality of what had just happened crashed over her. She had just killed a man with a spreadsheet. Roman stood up. He walked over to a crystal decanter resting on a side table. He poured 2 glasses of amber liquid. He walked over to Sadie and held one out. She didn't take it. She just stared at his hand. Drink it, Roman said. It helps with the shock. She took the glass with both hands. The heavy crystal clinked against her teeth as she took a swallow. The scotch burned down her throat, a fiery trail that forcibly grounded her racing mind. You're shaking, Roman observed. He stepped closer. He didn't touch her, but his proximity was a heavy, anchoring weight. You feel guilty. I just sent a man to die, she whispered, her voice fractured. You exposed a thief who was perfectly willing to let you and everyone else in this building go to federal prison to cover his tracks, Roman corrected. He reached out, his knuckles lightly grazing the side of her glass, steadying her trembling hands. You didn't kill him, Sadie. His own greed killed him. You just handed me the autopsy report. Sadie looked up. Roman's dark eyes were intense, analyzing her reaction, stripping away her panic until only the raw truth remained. He saw her exactly as she was. He wasn't disgusted by her fear, and he wasn't patronizing her. He was waiting for her to accept the reality of their world. "It doesn't get easier, does it?" she asked softly. "No," Roman said, his gaze locked onto hers. The dangerous, quiet intimacy in the room deepened, heavier than the scotch, heavier than the silence. "But you get stronger." 3 months changed a person. 3 months on the 42nd floor, surrounded by reinforced glass and men who carried suppressed weapons under tailored suits, fundamentally rewired Sadie's brain. She no longer flinched when the heavy oak doors slammed. She no longer checked the bank account that held a balance she once thought impossible. Most tellingly, she no longer felt a twist of nausea when she drafted a contract clause designed to financially gut a rival organization. She had become a surgeon with a fountain pen, excising threats to Roman's empire with cold, clinical precision. It was 10 o'clock on a Tuesday night. The high-rise was deserted, save for the security detail patrolling the perimeter. A brutal winter storm battered the city, throwing sheets of freezing rain against the floor-to-ceiling windows of her office. The glass vibrated with a low, menacing hum. Sadie sat at her desk, staring at a glowing monitor. She wore a charcoal turtleneck and tailored black trousers, her new armor. Her hair was pulled back into a severe knot. She was reviewing a series of shell company acquisitions tied to the Sullivan Syndicate, the same group that had tried to trap Roman with the port lease on her first day. They were pushing again, this time attempting to quietly buy up the trucking routes Roman used for his waste management fronts. The door clicked open. Sadie didn't jump. She recognized the rhythm of the footsteps. Roman walked in. He wore a black overcoat layered over a dark suit, his shoulders dusted with melting snow. He carried 2 white cardboard takeout boxes and a bottle of expensive red wine. "You're going to burn your retinas out," Roman said, setting the food on her glass coffee table. "The Sullivans are trying to establish a monopoly on the I-95 freight corridor," Sadie replied, not looking away from the screen. She highlighted a paragraph of text, her fingers flying across the keyboard to draft a counter-injunction. "If they control the way stations, they can bottleneck our legitimate shipments and starve the subsidiaries. Let my enforcers handle the Sullivans. Bullets are loud, liens are quiet." She finally hit save and closed the laptop, rubbing the bridge of her nose. A prolonged legal battle over the trucking licenses will bleed their operational budget dry before they ever get a truck on the road. Roman unbuttoned his overcoat, draping it over a chair. He opened the takeout boxes. The rich smell of garlic, truffles, and handmade pasta filled the sterile office. It was a stark contrast to the burnt coffee and grease of the Starlight Diner, a lifetime ago. "Come eat," he ordered softly. Sadie moved to the sofa. She sat beside him, the physical proximity sending a familiar, unwanted jolt of electricity down her spine. Roman poured the wine into 2 crystal glasses he pulled from her credenza. He handed her one. Their fingers brushed. His skin was warm. "You've adapted," Roman noted, watching her take a sip of the Barolo. "I survive," she corrected. "That's what I've always done." "You're doing more than surviving, Sadie. You're orchestrating." He leaned back, his dark eyes analyzing her with that same intense focus he applied to his ledgers. "Trent Mitchell was a blunt instrument compared to you. You see the entire board. You anticipate. I learned from the best." It was meant to be a dry observation, but it sounded dangerously intimate in the quiet room. Roman didn't smile. He looked at her mouth, then up to her eyes. The air in the room suddenly felt incredibly heavy. The professional boundary they had meticulously maintained for 3 months was thinning, eroding under the weight of late nights, shared secrets, and mutual respect. "Sadie," Roman began, his voice dropping an octave. He never finished the sentence. The heavy reinforced glass of the office window didn't shatter. It imploded. A concussive shockwave ripped through the room a split second before the deafening roar of an explosion echoed from the street below. The floor violently bucked. Sadie was thrown forward, her wine glass slipping from her grip and shattering against the coffee table. Before she could process the sound, a heavy weight crashed into her, driving her down into the plush carpet. Roman was on top of her, his broad shoulders completely shielding her body. A secondary blast shook the building, closer this time, raining pulverized drywall and ceiling tiles down upon them. The lights flickered and died, plunging the office into a chaotic, strobe-lit darkness, illuminated only by the red flash of emergency alarms. "Stay down!" Roman snarled into her ear, his voice rough and breathless. Sadie couldn't breathe. The air was thick with concrete dust and the acrid smell of burning wiring. She pressed her face into the carpet, her hands gripping the lapels of Roman's suit jacket in a blind panic. The heavy oak doors of her office were kicked open. Flashlights cut through the dust. "Boss!" It was Garrett, the broken-nosed guard. He held a matte black submachine gun, sweeping the ruined office. 2 other men in tactical gear flanked him. "We're clear!" Roman called out. He slowly pushed himself up, keeping one hand firmly planted on Sadie's back to ensure she stayed low. "Report." "Car bomb in the underground parking structure," Garrett coughed, waving away the dust. "Took out the structural support beams on the south side. The elevators are dead. The stairwells are filling with smoke. We need to move, now." "The Sullivans," Roman muttered, his voice terrifyingly calm. He looked down at Sadie. His face was covered in a thin layer of grey dust, a jagged cut above his left eyebrow, weeping dark blood down his cheek. "Can you walk?" Sadie nodded. Her vocal cords were paralyzed, but the survival instinct that had kept her alive through poverty and despair kicked into overdrive. Roman gripped her forearm and hauled her to her feet. He didn't let go. His hand was a vice, anchoring her to reality. "Garrett, take point," Roman barked, stepping over the ruined coffee table. "We take the service stairs to the sub-basement. We use the old maintenance tunnels." They moved into the hallway. It was a war zone. The sleek, minimalist corridors were choked with debris and panicked employees. Sprinkler systems hissed, raining dirty water down on the expensive carpets. Sadie kept her eyes locked on the broad expanse of Roman's back as they descended into the smoke-filled stairwell. The world she had built over the last 3 months was literally crumbling around her. But as long as his hand was wrapped around her arm, she knew she wasn't going to die tonight. The maintenance tunnel smelled of stagnant water, rust, and century-old brick. It was a subterranean vein running beneath the city, far removed from the polished marble and glass of the financial district. Garrett led the way, his flashlight beam bouncing erratically off the damp walls. Roman walked closely behind Sadie, his presence a solid, immovable wall at her back. They had been walking for 20 minutes, navigating the labyrinthine grid of forgotten subway spurs and utility corridors. The adrenaline that had fueled Sadie's initial sprint down 40 flights of stairs was rapidly burning off, leaving behind a cold, hollow exhaustion. Her tailored trousers were soaked with filthy water up to the knees. She was shivering, though she wasn't entirely sure if it was from the damp chill of the tunnel or the shock of the bombing. "Up ahead," Garrett called back, his voice echoing dully. The safe house access point. They reached a rusted iron grate. Garrett heaved it open, revealing a narrow set of concrete stairs leading upward. They climbed in silence, emerging into what looked like an abandoned auto repair garage. Heavy tarps covered the windows. The air was stale and smelled of motor oil. Garrett threw a heavy breaker switch on the wall. A row of caged industrial bulbs hummed to life, casting a harsh, yellow glare over the space. It wasn't just a garage. It was a fortress. Reinforced steel doors, a cache of medical supplies on a metal workbench, and a cot pushed into the corner. "Secure the perimeter," Roman ordered. "Get on the radio. Find out who survived the blast and where the Sullivan crew is moving." Garrett nodded, disappearing through a side door into an adjacent room. Roman turned to Sadie. The harsh lighting was unforgiving. It highlighted the pallor of his skin and the blood steadily dripping from the cut above his eye, staining the collar of his ruined white shirt. He looked tired. It was the first time Sadie had ever seen him look anything less than invincible. He walked over to a metal basin in the corner, turned on a squeaky faucet, and splashed cold water over his face. He winced as the water hit the gash. Sadie didn't think. She moved to the metal workbench, her hands moving with an automatic efficiency. She found a heavy-duty first aid kit, popped the latches, and pulled out antiseptic wipes, gauze, and a bottle of saline. She walked over to him. "Sit," she said. Her voice was raspy from the smoke, but it was steady. Roman looked at her. He read the quiet determination in her posture and offered no resistance. He sat heavily on a metal stool. Sadie stood between his knees. The physical boundaries that had existed in the glass office were entirely gone, stripped away by the raw necessity of survival. She tore open an antiseptic wipe. "This is going to sting," she murmured. "I've had worse," he replied, his eyes never leaving her face. She pressed the wipe to the cut. Roman's jaw tightened, the muscles clenching in rigid lines. But he didn't make a sound. She carefully cleaned away the dried blood and concrete dust, her fingers brushing against the rough stubble on his jaw. His skin was burning with a feverish heat. The silence in the garage was absolute, save for the muffled crackle of Garrett's radio in the next room. "You should have left," Roman said suddenly. His voice was a low rumble in his chest. Sadie paused, holding a fresh piece of gauze against his forehead. "When? After the blast?" "When I gave you the first paycheck." His dark eyes searched hers, stripping away all her defenses. "You had enough money to walk away. You could have moved to the suburbs, opened a quiet, legitimate practice. You didn't have to stay in this machine." "I didn't want a quiet practice," Sadie said honestly. The words hung between them, a stark admission of her own dark evolution. She taped the gauze in place, her hands lingering for a fraction of a second longer than necessary. She lowered her arms, but she didn't step back. "I spent my whole life playing by rules that were rigged against me. Here, I write the rules. And tonight, you almost died for those rules." "But I didn't." Roman reached up, his large, calloused hand wrapped gently around her wrist. He didn't pull her closer, but he didn't let her pull away either. His thumb brushed over the frantic, racing pulse beneath her skin. "I put a target on your back," Roman said. The cold, pragmatic boss was gone. The man sitting on the stool was entirely human, heavily burdened by the collateral damage of his violent life. "The Sullivans attacked the financial records first. They know who you are. They know what you do for me." "I'm not a waitress anymore, Roman. I know the risks. Knowing the risk and bleeding for it are two different things." He shifted his grip, his hand sliding up her forearm, his fingers tracing the bruised skin where he had grabbed her during the escape. The touch was agonizingly tender. I don't lose what belongs to me, Sadie. I won't let them touch you. It was a possessive statement, arrogant and deeply territorial. A year ago, it would have repulsed her. Now, standing in a dirty underground garage, smelling of motor oil and blood, it felt like a promise she desperately wanted him to keep. Sadie looked down into his eyes. The cynicism and the exhaustion melted away, leaving only a raw, undeniable truth. I belong to myself, Roman, she said softly. But I choose to stand with you. Roman's breath hitched, a minute physical reaction that betrayed the iron control he usually maintained. He stood up slowly, closing the remaining inches between them. He was so close, she could feel the heat radiating off his body, could smell the cordite and the Barolo wine on his breath. He reached up, his hand tangling gently in the messy knot of her hair, resting heavily against the nape of her neck. He tilted her chin up. Then God help anyone who tries to take you from me, Roman whispered. The styrofoam cup was brittle. Sadie squeezed it, feeling the cheap material yield under her fingertips. The coffee inside was cold and tasted of copper, but she drank it anyway. Dawn had bled through the cracks in the safehouse tarps, casting long grey shadows across the concrete floor. Roman was standing by the metal workbench. He had stripped off his ruined suit jacket and the bloody white shirt. He wore a plain black t-shirt that clung to the heavy muscle of his chest and arms. He was loading a Glock 19. The metallic snick-clack of bullets sliding into the magazine was the only sound in the room. Garrett stood by the reinforced door, a tactical shotgun slung across his chest. The radio on Garrett's hip crackled. He listened to the earpiece, his face grim. 3 dead in the lobby, Garrett reported, his voice flat. 2 in the parking garage. The Sullivans are moving on the Bronx waste management yards. They think you're in the rubble, boss. They're making a play for the territory before the dust settles. Roman slammed the magazine home. He racked the slide. The sound was violent and absolute. Have the strike teams rally at the Bronx perimeter. We push them into the river. Roman. He stopped. He turned to look at Sadie. She was sitting on the edge of the cot, her ruined slacks stiff with dried mud and plaster dust. She looked exhausted, battered, and utterly out of place in a room filled with armaments. But her eyes were sharp. Bullets are loud, Sadie reminded him quietly, echoing her own words from the night before. They blew up my building, Sadie. They tried to kill you. Roman's voice was a low, dangerous rumble. The restraint he had shown earlier was gone, replaced by the cold, predatory instinct that had built his empire. This isn't a zoning dispute anymore. This is war. You don't fight a war with a fountain pen. You do if the pen is a detonator. She stood up. Her legs were shaky, but she locked her knees and walked over to the workbench. She pushed a box of hollow-point ammunition aside and looked at Garrett. Do we have a secure laptop? Something not connected to the corporate servers? Garrett glanced at Roman. Roman gave a slight nod. Garrett reached under the workbench and pulled out a heavy, military-grade Panasonic Toughbook. He flipped it open and powered it on. Sadie pulled up a metal stool. She cracked her knuckles. When I started drafting the injunctions against the Sullivan trucking acquisitions last week, I knew they would retaliate. They're blunt instruments. Corner a rat, it bites. So, I built a dead man's switch into the corporate registry files. Roman stepped closer. He looked at the screen, then at her. Explain. They attacked the financial records because they wanted to destroy the paper trail we were building against them, Sadie said, her fingers flying across the rugged keyboard as she accessed a heavily encrypted offshore server. But I didn't store the primary evidence in the building. I stored it on a dormant server in Geneva, and I linked its activation to the active network on the 42nd floor. She paused, hitting the enter key. A progress bar appeared on the screen, filling rapidly. When the car bomb took out the power grid and severed the 42nd floor's connection, the Geneva server registered it as a hostile suppression, Sadie continued, her voice devoid of emotion. It triggered an automated data dump. Garrett frowned. A dump to who? To the SEC, the IRS, and the FBI field office in Manhattan, Sadie answered. I didn't just send them Sullivan's routing numbers. I formatted the data packets to look like an internal leak. I used the digital signature of Sullivan's own chief financial officer. The progress bar hit 100%. A green box flashed on the screen. Packet received. Silence fell over the garage. Roman stared at the screen, then slowly shifted his gaze down to Sadie. You framed his own people, Roman said. I seeded paranoia, Sadie corrected, looking up at him. Sullivan is a paranoid man. By noon, the FBI will be raiding his port warehouses. The IRS will freeze his dummy accounts. But more importantly, Sullivan will think his own inner circle sold him out. He won't be sending hit squads to the Bronx, Roman. He'll be too busy interrogating his own lieutenants. The syndicate will eat itself alive from the inside out. Garrett's radio crackled again. The voice on the other end was frantic, entirely stripped of its usual professional calm. Garrett listened for 30 seconds. He pulled the earpiece out, staring at Sadie with a mixture of awe and profound unease. Feds just breached the Sullivan loading docks, Garrett said slowly. Helicopters, SWAT, the works. Sullivan's right-hand man just got shot by his own security detail at a red light in Queens. It's a bloodbath. Roman didn't look at Garrett. He kept his eyes locked on Sadie. He reached out, his hand wrapping around the back of her neck, his thumb tracing the line of her jaw. His skin was still hot, his grip possessive and anchoring. He leaned down, his face inches from hers. The smell of cordite and dried blood surrounded them. I hired a lawyer, Roman whispered, his voice rough with a dark, consuming reverence. I got a queen. Sadie didn't flinch. She leaned into his touch, the cold, clinical part of her mind finally quieting. The world outside was burning, tearing itself apart exactly as she had designed it to. But inside the damp, concrete walls of the safe house, grounded by the heavy weight of Roman's hand, she felt entirely, ruthlessly safe. Checkmate, she whispered back. That wraps up the explosive story of Sadie and Roman. From a diner waitress dodging rent to a ruthless tactician bringing down a rival syndicate without firing a single shot, Sadie proved that the sharpest weapon in the room is always a brilliant mind. But in Roman's world, every victory comes with a price. Do you think Sadie can handle the empire she's helped secure, or will the darkness finally consume her? Let us know your thoughts in the comments. If you enjoyed this story, please hit that like button, share it, and subscribe for more.